What is business ethics? In this video, I will start with the definition of business ethics, which is very broad. We will separate the law from morality. We will talk about business in terms of the philosophical tensions that arise when doing business. Let's start with a basic definition. It's the study of or the practice of evaluating the principles or standards that guide operations of individuals or organizations to balance profit with obligations. That's a mouthful. Let's break that down in several ways. First of all, you can study business ethics. Like at a college, there will be a course called business ethics. You can also practice business ethics if you're a professional in the corporate world. Somebody might ask you in your interview, what is your business ethics? What's your framework for doing business? So those are different things. The study or practice of evaluating the principles and standards. Philosophy is the science of the sciences through which you can study absolutely anything that exists, including whether something exists at all. And one of the many branches of philosophy is called ethics, where the thing that you are studying involves behaviors, asking whether they are the right thing to do, not how people do act, but how people should act. And ethics has many different branches as well. One of the things you can do with ethics is apply the theories about how people should act to different scenarios. And when you are doing that, it's called applied ethics. Applied ethics is one of the three different ways to do ethics. And when you're applying the ideas of how we ought to behave in the context of business, that's when you get this course, business ethics. But there's another thing that you can do with ethics, and this is called meta ethics. Here, you're asking background questions like, what is the source of morality? Business ethics is the study or the practice of evaluating the principles or the standards that guide operations. Well, where do we get those principles or standards? They come from a subfield called metaethics that's under the heading of ethics, that's under the heading of philosophy. In metaethics, you're wondering where we even get the principles of what is moral. Where do our ideas of what's right even come from? So here, built into our definition of business ethics, is a meta-ethical question about the source of those principles. Whereas when you're just doing business ethics, oftentimes you're not asking questions of where do our ideas of righteousness even come from. Those are in the background, already established somehow, and you're working with those principles to see if they are actually going to give you the kind of balancing act that you want between making a profit, which in theory is the goal of a business, and satisfying your obligations, which is the part of ethics that comes in. So that's a little note about principles and standards. Let's dig deeper. There are some standards like be loyal to your company. There are some standards like treat your employees respectfully. And those two things might come into a conflict with one another. Assume that you value loyalty and you value your company's reputation. How would you respond to this whistleblower case? Well, you wanted your employee to come straight to you and to tell you that there is some kind of issue in the production of your business. But they didn't. Instead, they went straight to a news media outlet. What do you now owe that person? They've probably hurt your company's reputation. And so here, there's two things that you probably value as a business owner, and both of them have been disrespected by your employees' actions. But are you allowed to fire them? Among the different laws that are set up in the United States is a law that protects whistleblowers. So, on the basis that an employee has spread the news about something going wrong within a company, you are not allowed to fire that employee. The example helps us see how business ethics is really about balancing doing the right thing, your obligations, your responsibilities, and the business aspect, which has to do with margins and making a profit. So, this balancing act here would ask the owner of the company or the person making the decisions, a board perhaps, to decide how to balance these two conflicting values. One, wanting to make money, have a good reputation, respect the employees, employee welfare, and the other, which is to get rid of anybody who might be hurting the reputation of the company or costing money to the company. And these things are hard to balance. Let's think about the question here of obligations. The law is a code of conduct that is required of businesses, and there's different kinds of businesses: an LLC, a B Corp, a C Corp. It doesn't really matter. There are different laws that are from the government that are going to tell you how you're allowed to operate. For example, you're not allowed to commit fraud. Okay. For example, you're not allowed to work an employee for 24 hours straight without any breaks. For example, you can't fire somebody for absolutely no reason, or for a reason that is based on their sex or their gender or their. Okay. So there's these different laws. That is not the exact same thing as ethics. So when we're talking about business ethics, we're asking about the principles that ought to be or are actually guiding the operations of a business separate from the actual law. What the law requires is a baseline, a minimum requirements, a prerequisite in order to keep your license and continue operating as a business. But what business ethics asks you to consider is what goes beyond the law. For example, the law does not require that a company gives bonuses. But you might think that if in a quarter the profits are triple what they usually are, that company may be obligated to give small bonuses to key figures within the company that contributed to that high quarterly profit. However, that's not a requirement. So you might think that companies are obligated socially, morally. It would be an ethical consideration for the business to give bonuses, but not a legal consideration. Business ethics is looking at what people should do, not what they're required by law to do, because the law and morality come apart. Let's move on to other philosophical tensions that would have to be balanced when you're doing business ethics. When you're thinking about the principles that are going to guide how a business operates in order to balance out your profit and your obligation, you might be thinking of things in terms of shareholder versus stakeholder. Here is a poorly drawn scale that's asking you to consider a business's value of their stakeholders, like the employees themselves or the community in which the business operates, and their other value, which is their investors, their shareholders. What would be more important to somebody? And that's a question that comes up within business ethics. So some people, for example, believe that a business is successful in relation to its profit. And there you should obviously value the shareholder more. Anything you can do to increase your profit is good, even if it harms your employees or the community, so long as you meet basic minimum legal requirements. Some people in business ethics instead think that it's okay to make less money in order to fulfill your social or ethical or moral obligations to the community where the business operates or to the actual employees. So this remains a question. What exactly is the way a business should operate? What standards? We can value both and still ask the question, which one is more valuable? Here's another philosophical tension. If there's a business that operates in more than one city, it could be all across the country or it could be all across the world. there's a tension here between the principles that the company should adopt to guide its operations. Should you think, for example, about the relativism that comes up when you're dealing with different kinds of people? If, for example, you have a company that's based out of China but also has some of its warehouses in America and Australia, you might think that you should have different policies for those three different cultures. Of course, you would have different laws you need to satisfy for those three different governments. Or should it be the case that when a business is operating, it should try to have one guiding principle that is going to be accepted across all of its different iterations of the company? Three people who come up a lot in the question of the theory behind business ethics is Adam Smith, Milton Friedman, who thought that you should absolutely prioritize making as much money as possible within legal bounds and not add any obligations onto yourself, and also R. Edward Freeman, who thought the opposite, actually, that you should think about your environmental impact, your social impact, the psychological impact of your business, and it would be okay to put that value instead of the value of profit. But these are just three. And what we've done today is just unpack some of that as a tip of the iceberg. I hope you learn more.